Good morning, everyone. If you're on the West Coast like I am, or good near noon in the East Coast, and good wherever you are to everyone else. Welcome to Big Data China. I'm Scott Rozelle. I'm a co-director of the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions here at Stanford University. And on the screen today, going to be moderating the meeting will be Scott Kennedy. I wanted to thank everyone that's participating today, and I'm going to welcome you here. This is a feature in a series of features that SCCEI, our center, and CSIS are putting together to really take sort of the top empirical-based, data-based research in the world and bring it to Washington, D.C., to the U.S. or wherever you are, to really try to help us understand what's happening inside China and what's happening between China and the rest of the world. And it's obviously this relationship, China as a nation is very important in so many dimensions today. So welcome here today. We have some fantastic panelists, and there'll be lots of discussion, and look forward to interacting with everyone on a continuing basis. Right now, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Scott Kennedy. Scott's the senior advisor and trustee chair in the Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I always call it CSIS. Scott and I have known each other many years, and he's really become a leading authority on the Chinese economy, Chinese economic policy, et cetera, et cetera. Kennedy has been traveling to China for over 30 years, most recently in the fall of 2022, and very few of us have been over there so recently, when he visited Beijing and Shanghai as the first member of the Washington policy community to travel to China since the COVID-19 pandemic. His specific areas of expertise, and there are many, include industrial policy, technology innovation, business lobbying, U.S. China commercial relations, and global governance. So, Scott, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you're surrounded by a bunch of very interesting people that I think are going to really enlighten us on today's topic. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And it's great having this collaboration on Big Data China between Stanford and CSIS. We've come out with a series of features over the past year and a half, which I think help build bridges between the scholarly community's best cutting edge research and topics that Washington, D.C. needs to know. Today is another step in that progress, and I'm delighted that we will not be discussing balloons today in this event, although that is the topic of many other conversations in Washington. We're going to focus on something which I know is much more important, which is the question, how private are Chinese companies? And, there was an era earlier in my career, and those of others who are here, when there were good guys and bad guys in the Chinese economy. Good guys, Chinese private companies, bad guys, the state-owned enterprises. You could distinguish between one side or the other. Those days now seem long gone. Huawei, TikTok, Chinese efforts to buy land in different cities around the United States and agricultural land, all now part of the American policy conversation, which seems to think that we should treat all Chinese companies as the same, as identical, as threatening and worrying. Luckily, we have today some scholars with us who have done deep research on the corporate governance of Chinese companies that can help us answer this core question, which is relevant both for scholars and for the policy community, is how should we think about Chinese companies based on their ownership, based on other characteristics, their operations, and the role of the party state. So I'm going to introduce our featured scholars in just a second. They're going to present some of their work, which we just issued as a feature and put some context around it, which you can find on our website for Big Data China. And then we're going to have commentary. So I'm going to introduce Lauren Yu-Hsin Lin and Curtis Milhaupt in a second. And then once they're done with their presentation, luckily we're going to hear from three fantastic analysts who know China's economy just about better than anyone: Barry Naughton, Martin Chorzempa, and my colleague Ilaria Mazzocco. And then we're going to open up the floor to everyone who's watching today to offer your questions and feedback in this conversation. So let me introduce today's featured scholars. Lauren Lin is an associate professor and program director of LLM studies at the City University of Hong Kong's School of Law. Her recent projects examine the role of the state in corporate governance, focusing on the effects of formalizing the role of corporate party committees in Chinese companies, as well as the implementation of a social credit system on corporations in China, topics that will be discussed today. Her research on Chinese corporations has generated policy impacts leading to rule changes, has been cited by the Delaware Court of Chancery, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. Her collaborator is Curtis Milhaupt, who is the William F. Baxter Visa International Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and a senior fellow by courtesy of the Freeman Spokane Institute of International Affairs. He is an internationally recognized expert on comparative corporate governance, the legal systems of East Asia, including Japanese law and state capitalism. In addition to numerous scholarly articles, Curtis has co-authored or edited 7 books, including most recently Regulating the Visible Hand, The Institutional Implications of Chinese State Capitalism. So Lauren and Curtis, thank you so much for your amazing scholarship and also your willingness to share your insights with the policy community, which we featured in today's Big Data China feature. I want to turn the floor over to both of you. Look forward to your comments, and then we'll turn to the commentators once you're done. Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to both Scott's and your respective centers for hosting us. Lauren and I are delighted to have an opportunity to share our research with everyone. Lauren, if you would share the screen for us. In our research, Lauren and I have tried to understand at a fairly granular level the channels of influence of the Communist Party in Chinese corporate governance. And as we'll discuss very briefly this morning and share some of the key findings with you, we think that the research suggests that the scope for being a truly private company in China is getting smaller and smaller under policies pursued by Xi Jinping. But nonetheless, there is still significant heterogeneity among Chinese firms in their willingness to accede to party influence inside the firm, and also some important market constraints on the ability of the party state to impose its will on at least publicly listed companies. Next slide, please. One of the both fascinating and also, I think, frustrating and perhaps even threatening aspects of Chinese corporate governance is that there are actually two systems of governance in a Chinese firm. The one that's shown on the left side here is the one that is familiar to corporate governance scholars throughout the world, in which state and private shareholders act through the shareholders meeting. And indeed, in China today, there is increasingly mixed ownership between state and private investors, acting through a shareholders meeting, who are then appointing a board of directors, rather electing a board of directors, who in turn appoint management. This is all very, very familiar. But it's also somewhat misleading because there is a shadow corporate governance system in Chinese firms provided by the Communist Party. So in Leninist fashion, the party shadows the organizations of the private sector and the business sector in the same way that it shadows the government. There are internal party organizations in firms. I think this is well known, as well as a system of dual appointment. So corporate executives in China typically wear 2 hats, a corporate hat and a party hat, with the chief executive officer simultaneously being the party secretary of the committee internal to the firm, and the second in command wearing the hat of deputy party secretary. Now, what we're going to suggest is that, as I said, under Xi Jinping, there have been a variety of policies both to formalize and to elevate the role of the party committees internal to the firm, and a variety of other policies that are seeking to strengthen the role of the party state in corporate governance. Next slide, please. So here's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to address our research on the so-called party building or Dangjiang policy, again, attempting to formalize and elevate the role of these party committees in corporate governance. I'll then turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk about the corporate social credit system, which is a system that runs parallel to the private individual social credit system, which has garnered more media attention than the corporate side. And then she's going to say a few words about so-called special management shares. This is an emerging development, the Chinese party state taking shares in private companies. This is an area, I think, which needs much more scholarly and policy focus. Next slide, please. So turning to the party building policy, in 2015, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the State Council promulgated a policy, as I said previously, to elevate and formalize the role of the party in Chinese corporate governance. And the way they implemented this was to circulate a set of 10 model charter provisions that SOEs, that state-owned enterprises, were required to adopt into their charters. Now, this requires, very importantly, shareholder input. So 2/3 of the shareholder vote are required to adopt amendments to corporate charters. Now, if you look at the list here, Lauren and I have, for analytical purposes, grouped them by content. But what you can see rather quickly is that they're not all created equal. Some of them are purely symbolic, follow the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. But look at what we've called D1 and D2. These are provisions that would give the internal party committee a higher role than the board of directors and the management in running the company, something that runs completely counter to standard corporate governance principles. Also look at P1. This would give the party the power to nominate directors and managers, again, quite separate from and apart from standard corporate governance norms. So in this research, we scraped the web to find the corporate charters of all approximately 3,400 public A-share listed non-financial companies in China to determine three things. First, had the company adopted a charter amendment in response to this policy? Secondly, which of these provisions did they adopt, because they did not all adopt them uniformly? And third, what were the characteristics of the firms that adopted some of these provisions? Next slide, please. So very briefly, going to our key takeaways, we found in the period 2015 to 18, so the first 4 years of this policy, 90% of listed SOEs adopted at least one of these provisions. Now, note that this policy was mandatory for state-owned enterprises, and yet 4 years in, 10% of SOEs had not adopted any of these provisions, suggesting some level of pushback by the SOEs. What we found was that SOEs with more direct state ownership and smaller private shareholders who could push back against the intrusion of the party into their corporate governance were more likely to adopt these provisions than other SOEs. But by the same token, companies that were listed on foreign stock exchanges were less likely to adopt intrusive corporate governance provisions, suggesting that there was pushback from major private shareholders against this intrusion into their corporate governance. At the same time, very interestingly, we found that 6% of private firms had adopted some of these provisions, and yet we could not find even a single statement, public statement by the government or the party suggesting or requiring that private firms adopt these provisions. What we found was that politically connected private firms were much more likely than others to adopt any of these provisions, but that overwhelmingly they tended to adopt the symbolic provisions as opposed to the more intrusive corporate governance provisions. Next slide, please. So here is a look at the type of provision that were adopted in this period. You see that among the SOEs, more than half of them were willing to give over significant decision-making power to the internal party committee. Also, a majority were willing to give significant personnel power to the Communist Party. On the POE side, we see, not surprisingly, I think, much less willingness to adopt these intrusive provisions. And yet, nonetheless, 25% of the provisions adopted did give this very strong decision-making authority to the internal party cell. Next slide, please. Now, in preparation for today's session, we updated our research to see what had happened in the period from 2019 to 2022. And I think the big takeaway here, if you look at the right side of the chart with private firms, we see a big spike in the adoption of party building amendments by private firms. There is a slight decrease in adoption by SOEs, but this is the result of the increased number of SOEs, not a result of repeal of any of these provisions. Next slide, please. So finally, if we look at the type of provisions adopted over this entire period, 2015 to 22, we see that things have stayed roughly the same on the SOE side, but on the private sector side, we see dramatic decline actually in the percentage of provisions that give over dramatic corporate governance authority to the Communist Party and its internal cells. So I think the takeaway briefly from this line of research is that we see an expansion in the influence of the internal party cells as a formal matter in Chinese companies, both SOEs and POEs. But very importantly, there's significant heterogeneity, as I said earlier, in the willingness of companies to actually hand over substantive corporate governance authority to the party, and a suggestion that there are some significant market constraints on the ability of the party to impose its will on firms of all types. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Lauren, to discuss our next research project.
Thank you, Curtis. So next, I will introduce the second channel to influence, that is social credit system. So social credit system is actually a data-driven system that initiated by the Chinese government in 2014 to rate the trustworthiness of every market participants in China. So it is a legal enforcement program that serves as a substitute for the weak legal system in China, and also an alternative to the Western rule of law ideology. It's a very ambitious program that is still developing, and the implementation is actually locally administered. So every city and province is now actually experimenting with their own rating system and try to build a database. So far, Zhejiang is the only province that publicized the public score, the public credit score. So our research is actually centered on the score published by the Zhejiang government. Now, for social credit profile, so what it evaluates or included are two parts. One is the public credit information, and the other is the market credit information. So for public credit information, that collected data generated actually from the interaction between the firms and the government agencies. So that includes whether the firm has been blacklisted by government agency, or whether you receive judgments, court judgments, or administrative penalties. So right now, market credit information has not been included into the system. So our research actually focused on the public credit scoring system in Zhejiang. There are 5 main categories for scoring, and with a maximum score of 1,000. So that includes basic data, finance, taxation, governance, compliance, and social responsibility. Now, the first 4 categories are quite self-explanatory. For social responsibility, what it evaluates is actually whether firms, made charitable donations, engage in volunteer services, or receive awards from the government. So the overall, there's a rating will be given based on total points. So ranging from excellent to poor, there are 5 ratings. So the consequence will be that if you receive a bad rating, then you will be at a disadvantage in accessing to finance, receiving government approvals, or subject to more inspections. So our finding from collecting the first available data in Zhejiang is as follows. So our preliminary finding is that we think that CSIS is ostensibly actually neutral. So highly leveraged firms are actually receiving lower total scores, which is reasonable because if you are highly leveraged, you are in financial distress, you're more likely to default in contract and receive and maybe not paying court judgments or taxes. And better governed firms actually receive higher scores in compliance, and state shareholding actually do not lead to higher scores. But interestingly, we find that politically connected firms actually score higher. So by political connection, we mean that we examine whether the CEO and directors have served in certain government or party positions. And political connections actually only helps to boost the score in the social responsibility category. So overall, we think that CSIS is not only a law enforcement or public governance program, it has the potential to modify corporate behavior and also incentivize firms to comply with party-state policy priorities, especially through the social responsibility category. But this scoring criteria actually can, in the future, be modified by the government according to the latest policy priorities. So finally, with the implementation of CSIS, we think that China might be transitioning from state capitalism to a technology-assisted variant, that what we call surveillance state capitalism. The use of big data, which is also the theme of this series, is something to watch in the future. So next, I want to introduce special management shares, which is actually a hot topic in corporate China right now. Special management share is actually similar to the golden shares that is commonly seen in Europe, where the state, usually through investment vehicles, will take stakes, usually 1%, mostly in media, internet, and platform business, where the state will be granted special management rights, also one board seat, and usually the state can appoint a chief editor in charge of content review. So this is a way where CCP can extend political control and censorship in private companies. So the companies being affected so far include those very large and well-known internet platform companies, including Alibaba, Tencent, also ByteDance, the Chinese version of TikTok, and many other companies. So recently, there are news media reports that shows that at least, Bilibili and maybe other firms, they are actually asking for government to take a special management share in their company so that it has a better chance to get license and maybe other benefits. So we see that maybe this has become a new form of political connection. And it's not only beneficial to the party state, but also valuable for the private firms that are seeking rent from the government. So in conclusion, we of course observe that the influence of CCP in corporate governance is expanding. And as a matter of policy and also the CSIS, we see that the system creates a set of incentives for firm managers to include party priorities in their corporate compliance and also in their business strategies. However, our finding also shows that this expansion actually subject to the constraints from the market norms and also corporate governance norms. So of course, this expansion has major potential implications for not only domestic Chinese economy, but also in international relations. So that concludes our presentation, and I look forward to a panel discussion. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, Curtis and Lauren, thank you so much for laying out the highlights of your research agenda. It's really important from a scholarly perspective to understand the trends in corporate governance in China, the relationship between the state and market actors, but also from a policy perspective, trying to understand how governments like the United States or others I give you all a super high rating. CSIS doesn't participate directly in the corporate social credit system, but if we did, we'd give you all a high rating. I think also what your research shows is that there's a lot of variation across companies, but it's also a moving target. So really appreciate the updated data that you've got. And I thought it's interesting. I think it's interesting just for folks to note the data on the corporate social credit comes from Zhejiang, which is home to Alibaba, Geely, and other famous companies that Americans may have heard of. Let's turn now to our commentators who are going to give their thoughts about this research agenda and what it means. And luckily, we're joined today by people that I depend on for basic understanding, deep understanding about the direction of China's economy. Barry Naughton is the So Kwan Lok Chair of Chinese International Affairs at UC San Diego. He is one of the world's most highly respected economists working on China. He's an authority on the Chinese economy with emphasis on issues relating to industry, trade, finance, its transition to a market economy. His recent research focuses on regional economic growth in China and its relationship to foreign trade and investment. He has addressed economic reforms in Chinese cities, trade between the United States and China, and the relationship between mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And he is most recently the author of The Rise of China's Industrial Policy, 1978 to 2020, which I strongly encourage everybody to go read if you want to understand China's governance of its economy. Martin Chorzempa is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Before joining the Peterson Institute, he was a Fulbright scholar in Germany and a Luce scholar at Peking University's China Center for Economic Research. His research focuses on financial technology and digital currency, as well as technology and national security issues like export controls and foreign investment screening. His most recent book, which again, I encourage everyone to go read, is The Cashless Revolution, China's Reinvention of Money and the End of America's Domination of Finance and Technology, which came out last October. And third, Ilaria Mazzocco, my colleague here at the Trustee Chair. She's a senior fellow with us, joined about a year and a half ago. Prior to joining CSIS, she was a senior research associate at the Peterson Institute, where she led research on Chinese climate and energy policy for Marco Polo, the Institute's think tank. She holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins SCCEI, where her dissertation investigated Chinese industrial policy by focusing on electric vehicle promotion efforts and the role of local governments. So Barry, Martin, and Ilaria, thank you for joining us. In addition, Ilaria, thank you for your work on putting together today's feature and helping get this conversation rolling. I want to ask the three of you a common question and give each of you some time to offer your reactions, which is just first from an analytical perspective. How do you evaluate this stream of research about corporate governance in China, the relationship between market act? What are your big takeaways from the work Curtis and Lauren have done? And what have you learned the most? Why don't we start with Barry, Martin, and then Ilaria?
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks for that introduction. First, let me say what a pleasure it is. I've been consuming Curtis and Lauren's research for many years now, and this is the first time we've had a chance to meet virtually, and it's an enormous pleasure. This is great research. I mean, this is work that tells us what's happening on the ground, and in particular, this very curious interface between government policymakers and the ground level reality. And I think it really illuminates very, very important links in that chain. And I think the conclusion is absolutely right, that the scope for independent action by private firms in China is shrinking on a sort of year by year basis. So I think this is tremendous work. It's very solid. Let me just get the ball rolling with a couple of short comments about interpretation. I was delighted to see the data on the party constitutions updated through 2022, because I think this gives us an opportunity to answer what was one of my questions about the first paper that was published a few years ago, which is are the differences between state-owned enterprises and private the result of different adoption, or is it just different paces of adoption? And there's a sense and now they've partially answered that with the update. But we always need, I think, to keep in mind that one of the things that makes our job as analysts more difficult is that Chinese Communist Party has a familiar style of adoption in which they first telegraph that a certain change is essential, you can't avoid it, and then there's a certain legalistic implementation that takes more time. And they're very used to the idea that, well, certain people will need a little bit more time and others can implement right away. So one interpretation of the results, especially their earlier paper, is public firms and private firms are very different, but public firms are all going to be expected to introduce these new provisions, whereas private firms, but it takes time, and private firms don't have to. They can sort of do the things that they choose to for their own purposes. So I just wonder if a slight shift to a adoption pace perspective might add a little bit additional perspective to this really fascinating paper. I also think that in the model provisions that you talk about, it's really the decision-making provisions that are the most essential, because these are the ones, first of all, they're the most radical. I mean, they're really a transformation of the factory manager decision responsibility system that these firms had for 30 years into party management. So unambiguous in terms of the state firms, and really, I think, kind of shocking, actually, after everything that China has been through. The credit scores paper is also fantastic, really, really interesting. It's the first thing I've seen that really sort of lays out how the credit scores work at the corporate level. And the part of it that I wanted to see even more of was about the sub-indices. So anytime we use an aggregated index, including when Chinese uses aggregated social credit index, some information is lost, right, about the components that make up the bigger index. And if I understand this paper right, really the driver is this social responsibility sub-index. And I'd love to see more work that kind of brings that out. Then finally, I know I'm supposed to be really brief at the beginning here, so I'll just make one quick point about the special management shares. Again, this is something that people have been talking about for a decade. It's been denied repeatedly by the Chinese Communist Party. And now all of a sudden, oh, here it is. It's true. So once again, we see this distinctive implementation process. So that just makes our job as analysts more difficult. And I think these papers make a tremendous start in getting to the reality of what's happening and breaking through this more complex implementation process. So much more to say, but I better stop here and we'll have a longer conversation.
Well, excellent beginning, Barry, to get the ball rolling. Martin, over to you. Look forward to your comments.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Scott. And it's really an honor to share the panel with Barry, whose book I read when I was first learning about China. So much of any of my the thing that I say right will be based on what he says, and then anything wrong will be things I picked up from some other source along the way. I want to echo Barry's comment that this is extremely useful research, because we rarely have this kind of good data behind these topics that usually just kind of use a lot of Xi Jinping quotes. We get a lot of rhetoric that's kind of cited by people in Washington on the Chinese side, but usually very little about what are the actual channels. What do we mean when we say there's party influence? So I find this extremely fruitful research. What strikes me when I look at the research and the update that was presented here, there was a little bit of a wrench into what I was going to say, but not too much, is that we have very limited adoption actually in the private sector of this party building language compared to what one might expect if you follow the usual line in Washington. You'd expect that every single private firm has a party committee that is dictating to the entrepreneur exactly what they can do. And what you see, in fact, especially in the earlier numbers, 6% only of the private firms are adopting anything at all. And what they're adopting is overwhelmingly just symbolic kind of language that doesn't give the party direct control. So I find that super fascinating and important, and very counterintuitive to the way that people think about private firms in Washington. And then looking at the data that Ilaria had put together to put context on this, it looks like the official number of party cells in private firms is 1.48 million in 2019. That's coincidentally the exact same number of private party cells than there were in 2012 when Xi Jinping took office, and the number of private firms has doubled in the interim. So there's some really interesting stuff to dig into here about, that's not what someone would expect considering all the rhetoric about increased state influence. There's one point of context if I can plug a colleague's paper on this kind of issue. My colleagues Nicola Verone and Tianlei Huang put out research which showed that even after the tech crackdown of the last few years, the role that that we call nominally private firms play in the China's largest companies has remained extremely high and has risen consistently throughout Xi Jinping's tenure. So that's one area we don't see the really resurgence in the state sector. I'll kind of end by talking a little bit about what does party control mean and what this tells us about it. If you think about two categories of party control, one of them being the day-to-day influence over the firms, and the other is if the Ministry of State Security thinks there's a national security threat or cybersecurity threat, what are they going to do? I think that maybe although there are less checks on that kind of mechanism in China than in other places, I think most countries, if there's an acute national security concern, are going to get compliance from their firms. The question we're really digging into here is day-to-day, is there more influence? And so if we look at the golden shares, I think that's a really important thing to dig into. One thing that I have a bit of a difference on the presentation is that these golden shares, as far as I can tell, have really only been taken in media companies. Maybe the Full Truck Alliance is a different thing, but if you look at Alibaba, for example, the state did not take a golden share in Alibaba. They took a golden share in a media subsidiary of Alibaba, which I think is a really important distinction. And they're debating now exactly what to do on Tencent. So it's hard for me to tell whether the media is like the leading tip of a spear, if we're going to get special management shares all throughout the Chinese economy, or if it's just the absolute most sensitive sectors like content generation, which fits into ideology, where we see that. Is it just in this narrow area like it's been so far, or will that change? And then also one thing about this report, I think that really shows that private companies maybe are private, is that is really this continued difference in the adoption of these party building and private versus SOEs. And that fits into all the work that Barry and others have done over the course of the years about how different SOEs are managed with SASEX and all other things than private firms. So to conclude, I do think that it's safe to say, based on everything we've seen here, there is still a real private sector in China, even if it has less autonomy and less legal protections than in many other countries. But the future is very much in doubt due to the much higher level of state intervention and party building that's going on now, especially seeing that big rise in party building adoption recently. But I do also note that the government in China is trying to reorient and is worried about killing the golden goose, signaling they'll let up control a bit. And really the question is whether they'll be able to convince entrepreneurs that they will have that autonomy and safe property rights needed to invest again. And hopefully it goes back to what Scott Kennedy once wrote, which is, as a pro-development regime, the Chinese state is ideologically oriented towards business. That is from his magisterial book on business lobbying in China. So hopefully we go back to that. Thank you.
Scott is frozen.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Okay, I would just, I'm fading in and out. And that's simply because I'm at CSIS, and so therefore my connection should be weaker than anyone's. So Martin, thanks for your remarks. Let's turn it over to Ilaria now, the co-author of today's feature, for her initial analysis, following up on Barry and Martin's comments. Ilaria?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And thank you to everybody for participating in this event. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how important I think Curtis and Lauren's work is, because I was actually involved in sort of selecting it and deciding to feature it on our website. So obviously, I do think it's very important. I agree with what Barry and Martin have said so far, but I also wanted to highlight that the reason why I think this work is so important is that it is very complicated to actually evaluate Chinese firms because they are operating in a relatively unique kind of environment. So on the one hand, we do see that private firms are different on the whole from SOEs on average, but they also do operate in this environment that's where the freedom of private firms is shrinking, the lines may be blurring. And this, I think, it's not just in terms of the kinds of pressure that the government or the party state puts on firms, but it's also in the types of benefits, right? And I think Lauren kind of hinted at that. If you look at sort of the industrial policy side of things, private firms can be huge recipients of government support in ways that perhaps sometimes one thinks of SOEs receiving that kind of support, right? So it's very difficult sometimes to really understand the details and the differences between these, excuse me, between these kinds of firms. I'll pass it back to you, Scott. Sorry, I apologize.
Try this here.
Okay, looks like Scott is offline, but I guess I can take over as the CSIS person here. I'll just sort of, sorry, I apologize. I was choking a little bit, but that's just to say that it is, you know, I think the scholarship on this and the kind of quantitative research is really important to really sort of set the parameters and really better understand and provide us with better evidence with how to evaluate the state of both Chinese private firms as well as SOEs and the economic environment. I would start a new round of questions before letting Lauren and Curtis respond. Oh, Scott is back.
Back. Sorry for the mix-up. It's technology, folks. So we just do research on it. We don't know how to use it. Let me turn back. I want to turn back to Curtis and Lauren right now to get their initial reactions on the comments from Barry, Martin, and Ilaria. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll jump in first. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the comments. Of course, I agree completely, and I suspect Lauren does too with the comments. Just very briefly, Barry's points on implementation. Yes, very important to think about, particularly as you know, as lawyers. Implementation is important to us. We discovered that in the process of implementing the first round of party building amendments, some SOEs interestingly went back again and again to their SACE Act, whether it's local or central. And so that suggested a negotiation was going on. And again, I think it's very interesting that, you know, perhaps the common perception that the party just kind of dictates what the SOEs do and they step in line doesn't seem to actually be the reality of this. I agree completely on the focusing on the sub indices. We did not have a chance because of time constraints to go into that aspect of the paper, but it's certainly something that bears more attention. And actually, Scott Rozelle mentioned at the outset, we are working with his team to try to update this research and to dig more deeply into some of these issues. On Martin, I would just say I agree completely that there still is a private sector, but really it's the future that we're concerned about. And I think the point that you raised about the impact on entrepreneurship is very, very important. And I often think if I were a young Chinese entrepreneur, what would I make of the environment today, and what would that do to my incentives to create a private firm? Seeing what happened to Jack Ma and the like, I think that with respect to special management shares, really the question is what happens going forward, and does this expand? Do we see it limited to data and media companies, or does the Chinese government see this as a way of, in essence, switching from a regulator to a shareholder and having more direct influence in the firm? I think that's something really to watch for. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't want to talk too long, and I'll turn it over to Lauren for her reaction.
Thank you, Curtis. So thank you all for the great comments and also some suggestions. So I just want to actually I agree with Barry and also Martin's observation that we also think that the pattern of the adoption, that like the real adoption, really shows how it what does it mean by party building, right? So we see differences in adoption, like Curtis just mentioned. Even in the SOEs, there are various adoption pattern, and also even until the end date, end of 2018, there's still a lot of SOEs that didn't adopt single provision. So and for POEs, the updated data really helps, and we see that actually the large amount, although there are a great increase in the POE adoptions, until 2022. But actually the later adopters, they seem to adopt more symbolic provisions. So it seems that there is pressure. We know that there's pressure from the government, from CCP, to ask a POE to adopt, party building provisions after 2018. But it seems that the result is that the POE adopt simply just very symbolic provisions. So we believe that, or I believe that there's still autonomy in the private companies, and they, I think it's even some private companies might think that the having a party committee or a party secretary in the firm actually serve as like a channel for communication with the government. So in a way, maybe it's in a way beneficial to the private companies as well. As for the subcategories, the point that Barry mentions about corporate social credit system, we do want to look into like more nuanced analysis on what's the difference in the scoring in social responsibility category, and also we want to see actually how firms respond to their scores. Would they try to do something like make more donations or try to gather awards from the government and in order to boost up the score? So we now work with Scott to update the social credit, the scores, and we want to see maybe more analysis in our next project. So I think I'll stop here and maybe leave more time for our next discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot. I just want to let folks watching know, if you go to the feature on the CSIS website that we published today that summarizes the fantastic work of Lauren and Curtis, go to figure number 6 for looking at the sub-scores of some of the different metrics from this research that we were just talking about. When we turn to another question now, I'm going to invite everyone to chime in. Just feel free to raise your hand or just speak. I want to ask about the policy implications. Washington think tank Big Data China is about building bridges between scholarly research and its policy implications. In Washington, there now seems to be a consensus that all Chinese companies in some way, shape, or form are controlled by the party state. Might be through these shares, it might be through the amendments that they've changed to their operating constitution. It just might be a regulation like with national security that gives somebody the right to call up a firm or walk in the front door and demand any bit of data about all of us. That animates the conversation in Washington about TikTok, about Huawei, in local state legislatures around the country adopting regulations about purchases of land and property. How do you all think Washington should evaluate Chinese companies that they interact with at the regulatory intersection, whether it's about Chinese companies that are listing on American securities markets, the implementation of investment screening, export controls? What are the takeaways from this research that shows the gradual encroachment of the state inside firms, but still significant variation? What would your advice be? Maybe, and I know that this is something that was not initially in the research, it's really analytical about what is happening. But Washington needs some guidance about what we should do. Maybe we'll start with Barry, and then Ilaria and Martin, and then come back to Curtis and Lauren. And you all can tell us what you think we'll let you all have the last word on what you think your research means for Washington, but maybe get some initial remarks from our commentators.
It's a super difficult question, so let me do my best. I mean, I think the Curtis and Lauren's work clearly shows there is still a difference between state-owned and private firms, so they're not the same. It's not appropriate to say that the party controls private enterprises, but from the perspective of American policymakers, and when we're dealing with issues that are important to us, it's really crucial to note, first of all, I mean, Curtis and Lauren show that there are these important governance mechanisms that give the party, and to a certain extent the state, direct influence. I wouldn't call it control, but certainly influence directly into the governance structure of the private firms. But in addition, there are sort of extraordinary national security provisions. There's also many, many ways in which the party controls access to demand, domestic demand for private firms. And then, of course, there are also lots of ways to sort of disguise ownership. So there are at least sort of 4 different channels through which the party can influence private firms. And I think our policymakers have to say private firms are significantly influenced by the party, and we should not give them a pass. We should make laws about our own interests that probably will have to put public and private firms in China together into a single category.
Martin? Or Ilaria, I'm sorry, Ilaria next.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time since we actually wrote some of our thoughts, Scott, in the actual feature. But I think generally my thinking is that it's good to have provisions that require more transparency, right? But also better transparency on the U.S. side in the sense of setting very clear rules. So avoiding ad hoc regulation that comes maybe after the problem emerges, like TikTok, is probably helpful, and having clear rules from the beginning, right? So that at the same time requiring much better transparency from the firms, from Chinese firms, because there are some issues with with the types of influence that Barry just mentioned, right? And we know that there are these channels of influence. So actually understanding better how those channels of influence are actually used, and what the kinds of alignment there is with the party is quite important. But I'll let Martin give his comments. I know we're getting close to time.
Yeah, I really agree with both of the previous interventions, and I think this research could, in a sense, be a bit of a how-to for CFIUS or a future outbound investment regime, to actually dig into the corporate charter of this firm and figure out what is the machinery specific to this firm, in addition to understanding the things like social credit, which are in general apply to all firms, or maybe differently to different firms in different provinces, to help do some of this differentiation. But as Barry said, it's so complex. And if we think about, if one of these firms is private, doesn't have anything in the corporate charter about party influence, but is really, on the finger of a really important Chinese national security perspective, then I think the differentiation probably decreases quite significantly. If it's like, if the PLA really wants this, its technology, or if it has really sensitive data or potentially sensitive data it's getting abroad, I wouldn't do as much differentiation between state and private firms as you might in an area where they're buying agricultural land, for example, where it could be that this is likely that it's just a private sector firm who thinks it's a good idea to make some money and differentiate by going out, and we shouldn't necessarily be stopping that. So that's just a little bit of extra color I would add on what I thought was already a really great summary of the issues by Barry.
Lauren and Curtis, you didn't write this piece, this work for Washington, D.C., but what do you, following on the comments from Barry, Martin, and Ilaria, What do you think the biggest takeaways Washington should have in terms of the implications for regulation?
Well, I think the three panelists have really nailed it. I think that as a default, there is we should be skeptical of all Chinese firms. I think there's reason to believe that there are channels of influence for the party in all firms, whether SOE or POE. But going beyond that default, I think the policymakers really need to dig into the actual channels of influence. I don't think that there is any substitute for actually looking on a firm by firm basis and to really dig into this. I think the SEC's regulations, for example, implementing this Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which threatened to delist Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges if they don't comply with audit inspections, is an example of the lack of understanding of the channels of influence, because the disclosures required by the SEC are not very meaningful. And so I think that this idea of really there's no substitute for actually understanding on a firm by firm basis what is going on and how firms may be influenced by the party is really the key. I agree with Ilaria. It is really in the Chinese companies' benefit to be transparent about this. I think all Chinese companies operate under a kind of suspicion tax globally because of this concern that they are being influenced by the party. So it would be to their benefit to be much more transparent about all of this.
Lauren?
Yes. So I agree with Curtis about I think the implication of our research is really to ask the policymakers or regulators to look beyond ownership and to understand that there are this many different channels where CCP can influence a company, a private firm, and specifically. I think the influence, for example, the party building research really sheds light on you're not only going to look at whether they have party committee or not, but you're going to look at what powers do they have. Is it just a symbolic declaration, or they really have a say in the management? So I think that's really important, and for regulators to understand. These many different channels where CCP can influence. And of course, I agree with the panelists that, in addition to this, CCP and the party state, as a regulator, they can, like the tech crackdown that we see, they could use other forms, to regulate the private companies and so that could change, with the change of the policy in the CCP, and that's something also to look into. Yeah, so that's my brief reaction to Scott's question. Thank you.
Sure. We've had a terrific discussion based on fantastic research that we've featured today on Big Data China website. This is an issue that is going to only get more important. One of the things that jumps out at me on this work is if you know that Washington and countries around the world, governments around the world, are going to look more skeptically on Chinese companies with what Curtis calls a suspicion tax, then why is China doing this? Why is China making it more difficult for its companies to invest and do business globally? And I think the answer must be because that's a lower priority than their business in China and the ability of the party state to regulate and control and direct what Chinese industry does. That seems to be more important than how governments elsewhere respond. Or there must be the view that China's economy is so important economically and politically that very few governments around the world are going to act on those suspicions in a way that fundamentally restricts the opportunities of Chinese companies globally. I guess they're basically laying down the threat and saying, go for it. If you think you're going to try and control us and limit us, do it. We're going to do things our way. I think that sets up the possibility for continued significant tensions between China and the rest of the world, not just at the government level, at the party level, the diplomatic level, but at the corporate level. And there's this conversation that we've been having about decoupling between China and Western economies in the US. And this is the kind of issue that animates that kind of conversation. Can we build mechanisms to allow our economies, which are regulated so differently from the ground up, still effectively interact with each other, not just to make money, but to provide the types of corporate governance that investors, consumers, and others require? This is a huge challenge that is not going away. It is at the front and center of what Washington is thinking about with regard to U.S. China relations. I want to thank Lauren and Curtis for their fabulous work that they've done. They have launched an incredible agenda, and it looks like this work is going to go forward, and we're delighted. Look forward to your future publications. We know that Scott Rozelle is working on you with it as well. I want to thank Barry and Martin for their interventions and contributions today, to Ilaria for her great work, as well as Maya May in doing the research and putting together the figures that are in our feature, and for the folks at Sky that work with Scott Rozelle and all of my colleagues here at CSIS. Thanks to all of you. And we look forward to receiving additional feedback from everyone about today's feature and this work. This conversation will continue. Thank you all, and wherever you are, have a great day.